Preakness, Asteroid, War Admiral. If you are familiar with American thoroughbred racing, then these names are likely familiar to you. But what if I told you that a different racehorse captured the hearts of the American public before any of these famed horses? In fact, his blood runs through the veins of all of these thoroughbreds and many more. Before Bold Ruler, before Northern Dancer, and before Mr. Prospector came the greatest thoroughbred sire of all time, Lexington. Lexington's fame does not come from his racing career, but rather from his career as a stallion at stud. Lexington sired 575 in his lifetime, 230 of which won nearly 1,200 races. He is the sire of Preakness, the thoroughbred after whom the Preakness Stakes are named. These achievements are all well and good, but they don't make for a very exciting podcast. So why am I talking to you about Lexington today? Well, Lexington took his name from a city in Kentucky, a state that has long been considered akin to the Holy Land of American thoroughbred horses. But Kentucky was also a slave state. The story of thoroughbred racing in the U.S. is deeply intertwined with the story of African American enslaved people. And to tell the story of most racehorses owned in the American South, one must also tell the story of the people involved in their care and upbringing. So the story of Lexington is not only a story of horse racing, it is a story of race. Welcome to History from Horseback. So I was a little bit nervous when I started writing this because originally I was going to just be talking about Lexington himself, the horse. But then the more into the research I got, the more I was thinking, oh, well, there are some very important stories behind this, but they also do have to do with slavery and with racial inequality in the United States. And so I guess you could kind of say this is a little bit, I mean, I don't consider it controversial. There might be people out there who do consider it a little bit political.
Oh yeah, for sure. Everyone takes an opportunity to be like that sometime.
But whatever.
Yeah.
If you're have a big problem with even talking about slavery on a history podcast, then I don't think this is the podcast for you.
Yeah, most likely not. No. And I was going to say, it's not just a story about the horses. It's a story about, the people who were there doing most of the manual labor, which seems to be a very common theme in American history. And don't get me wrong, Australia is no better. People think it's a very happy, lucky, whatever sort of country. And I promise you, no, our history is just as dark, just as bloody, and just as shameful.
Yeah.
I must admit, this is something that I will probably learn a lot about today.
Yeah, I'll get a little bit into it. To start, I want to acknowledge our sources for today. So one of my sources is the book Horse by Geraldine Brooks, and it is a historical fiction that is based on Lexington's life. So quite a bit of it is fictionalized, but it is an excellent read and places a lot of the facts into context. Also, the afterword was a good factual summary on Lexington. And so I did get some of the information from that afterword. As an aside, I recommend this book. If anyone is looking into reading, I have found lately that I really enjoy historical fiction in general.
Adding this to my list then?
Yeah. I did enjoy it a lot. And it really does kind of capture, I feel, how horses can really link and connect people. Another source is the Smithsonian Magazine's article on Lexington. And then also the International Museum of the Horse has articles on Harry Lewis. That was written by Emily Leibcap. I am hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Fingers crossed for you.
Thank you. And later on, near the end of the episode, I'll talk a little bit more about the International Museum of the Horse because they actually have some pretty cool sources talking in general about Black American history and how it was involved with horse racing.
Nice.
Yeah. One March morning in 1850, a bay thoroughbred colt with 4 white socks stumbled to his feet for the very first time. The newborn foal's breeder, an American physician and thoroughbred enthusiast named Elisha Warfield, was likely satisfied to see the colt in good health. This baby was the product of one of Warfield's favorite broodmares, Alice Carneal, and the top U.S. thoroughbred stud at the time, Boston. The colt was named Darley.
Do you think that was a poke to the Dahlia Arabian, or do you think it was just a common Victorian name at the time?
I honestly don't know. I also found it really funny, like throughout my research of like during this like time period, the mid 17th century. No.
Close.
What I found kind of funny is that during the time in the mid 19th century, a lot of thoroughbreds just had full human names.
Human names? I was literally about to say that, just as you did. Like, when we went past Alice Carneal, I'm thinking to myself, all these horses way back then, they just gave them human names.
Yeah.
They would just pick their favorite, like, person or celebrity or whatever that they found, and were like, you know what? Let's just name this horse after this person.
They absolutely did that.
In my mind, I'm like, I would understand it if that was like a majority shareholder of the horse, and they're like, oh, bugger it, we'll just name it the same thing for the person that owns the horse. But like, that's not really how it worked. Yeah, very funny to me that they're just like, you know what, we'll just call them generic Victorian name number 4.
Yeah, and it's like, I understand it. We kind of do it nowadays where we'll name animals like after like a celebrity.
Yeah.
There's like a goose who's named like Donald Trump or something, and I find that hilarious. But I'm pretty sure Alice Carneal was just like some lady.
Yeah.
Who meant something to the person who named her.
Do you think Alice was upset about being named a horse being named after her, or do you think she was happy about it? That's what I want to know.
I don't know. You know, if a horse was named after me, I don't know, it'd be kind of weird.
I feel like if the horse was a winner,
yeah.
I'm down. If the horse was not a winner, I'd be like, ooh, a little too close to home, guys. What's going on there?
Nowadays it'd be pretty weird because it's like you Google your own name. And it's just like
it's just a horse, yeah. Although great way to provide yourself free internet security. Great way.
That's true.
To hide your identity. Have a really famous racehorse named after you.
They also named a lot of them just like after cities.
Yeah.
There's Boston, there's Lexington, and there were more. It was just like, well, he represents the city.
And then you had all the imports from France and Ireland and Great Britain, and they just had like completely different names. Like you could tell if it was an import because the naming convention was just like completely off the charts.
Darley had quite a few factors that played into his eventual success as a racehorse. One of these factors was his pedigree. Boston, his sire, would later be one of the first horses inducted into the National Racing Hall of Fame, having placed first in 40 out of 45 races. But Boston had an infamously terrible disposition, likely caused from mistreatment or health issues, and thus changed hands between trainers multiple times in his life. It was hoped that Darley would inherit his father's talent, but not his irritable temper. Darley grew to be a 15.3 hands high bay stallion. He was described as having nice conformation, but I found cited several times that he had what was described as a moose head. Seeing the paintings and images of Darley that exist now, his head looks pretty normal to me.
Yeah, our poor boy Darley.
And I don't know if you've looked him up.
Let me see what this what this boy looks like.
He's actually featured in our like title page art.
Oh, cute.
His head is like peeking out a little bit.
He doesn't really look all that different from anything else. He looks like a thoroughbred.
Yeah, I can kind of see where the moose head comes from just from like the profile. Like,
Yeah, like I guess if it's because he had like quite a flat nose, like I'm looking at a really, really old rendition drawing of him, and the way that they've drawn him is just I think it's probably because his nose was quite narrow and it might have looked head on, it might have looked very like broad. But then in this actual photograph that I'm looking at of him, he's got a Roman nose.
it might look Roman because he has that white snip.
Oh, yeah.
He's got such a long neck.
He does. It's also it ties into his front real weird. I'm not so sure about it, to be honest.
He looks like two different horses. Like, he looks like the body of a horse. And it looks like he took like the front neck and head and then
it's very interesting.
Like photoshopped it on.
What a guy.
Another factor towards Darley's success was that he had one of the best trainers in all of Kentucky, a man named Harry Lewis. At the time of Darley's birth and upbringing, Harry Lewis was a previously enslaved black man. Not much is known about Lewis's early life, other than the fact that he was born on the plantation of a man named Robert Burbridge. It was common during the time for wealthy thoroughbred owners to have black slaves work the stables, performing various barn chores, horse husbandry, and horse exercising. It's likely that Lewis rose through the ranks, starting as a stable boy and working his way up to groom, then possibly a jockey, then to trainer. By the late 1840s, Lewis was Burbridge's horse trainer and then the trainer for Captain Willa Viley. Under Viley, Lewis trained the champion racehorse Richard Singleton, another human name.
Exactly.
And he became well known as a trainer of champions. And I think Richard Singleton, the horse, was actually like named after some sort of political figure.
Yeah, it sure sounds that way. I mean, with a name like Richard Singleton.
For some reason, I can really picture a horse being named.
Yeah, but for some reason I'm picturing it, but the horse has a monocle for some reason. I'm not really sure.
Yes, same. At one point, by 1850, Lewis bought his freedom from Viley. As a free man, Lewis worked for Dr. Stephen Gano, also hoping I'm pronouncing that right, and also partnered with Dr. Elisha Warfield. Warfield, as an aging man who was looking to cut back on trips to the racetrack, agreed to lease Darley to Lewis as a racehorse. Considering that Lewis had already taken the role as Darley's primary trainer, this was an ideal agreement. The only issue? Lewis was a black man. It was illegal at the time for a black person to own and race a horse under their name. For this reason, Darley was raced under Warfield's name and his colors.
Okay, so something that really bothers me about this is that it was illegal. It wasn't just not a thing, it was actually outlawed. They specifically went in and outlawed that happening. Instead of just being like, oh, sorry, you can't do that. Like, they went, no, it's actually illegal for you to do that. You can't even try. That is insane to me.
Yeah. And something that I find really kind of insane at the time was this dichotomy. And I feel that Horst does a really good job. The author... That makes it sound like just horse.
I was a little confused for a hot second there, I'm not going to lie. I was like, oh, which horse? But okay, we'll follow along.
I feel that Brooks did a really good job in Horse at illustrating this dichotomy at the time where people who were enslaved at the time, they would sometimes get these opportunities to start working, to start making like money. And it kind of could give this semblance of like, oh, I'm actually building my own life. And that was actually like key to keeping enslaved people. Because if you have people who are just like completely hopeless, they have no hope in life at all, they have nothing to work for, nothing to live for, then they have nothing to lose.
Yeah.
And so you're actually much more likely to have people trying to escape, much more likely to have people inciting fights and riots and just being generally miserable. So it's like almost worse in that they were like constantly dangling these like carrots in front of
Yeah.
them, you know? I mean, or like it's so fucked up to just say like allowing people to have families. They're humans who have the right to
Yeah.
like create a family. But in the time, people who were enslaving people, they would allow them to create families because if you are enslaving someone's kid, they're much less likely to act up.
Yeah.
They're much less likely to try and run away. It's very screwed
Yeah.
up. And we're going to see very shortly how, like, basically they're kind of dangling this, like, fake, like, Lewis is free. And they're dangling this, like, idea of, like, oh, yeah, you kind of own this horse. Like, you're the trainer. You're so talented. But then we'll see how, at the same time, he's not given the same rights as.
It must have been like insanely frustrating too, to like know that all the effort that you put into something like that was ultimately going to be under someone else's name, and that like it wouldn't be until you were all long dead and gone that people would tell the true story about it. Like, it's just, oh wow, very, very wild.
In 1853, Darley entered the Phoenix Stakes and won both heats. Between the first and second heat, a syndicate of men named Richard Tenbrook, General Abe Buford, Captain Willa Viley, and Junius R. Ward offered to purchase Darley. Despite Lewis functionally being Darley's owner, he did not legally own the horse, and thus had little say in the purchase. Warfield sold Darley and one of his enslaved grooms to Tenbrook for $2,500, and Darley was renamed Lexington. To add insult to injury, the syndicate wanted to claim Lexington's winnings from the second heat of the race or deduct the winnings from what they paid Warfield. And this is because they came to the agreement to purchase Darley between the two heats.
Oh. I was going to say, that's a bit rich, but yeah, I mean, I can understand why they would argue that in the middle. They probably should have waited till the end to make it less annoying and messy for themselves, but I guess, yeah, why wouldn't they?
Well, also because he had been entered into the race already. So when you've already entered the horse into the race under the ownership of a certain person, I don't think that the money goes to the new owner. I think it goes to whoever entered them. In some sources, Warfield was the one who settled the dispute, while in others, it was the Kentucky Association. Ultimately, Lewis did end up with the $2,500 for the horse. While Lewis was paid money for the horse, he was still very close to essentially being cheated out of money by a group of white men. No matter the quality of Lewis's work or how great his accomplishments, he ultimately would be seen as lesser than white men. Something that it kind of shows is this parallel. So Lexington trades hands a couple times. He has his name changed. Same with the groom who goes along with Lexington.
Yeah.
Because back then, a lot of the times with enslaved people, their name was so-and-so's blank. So before Harry Lewis got his full name, he was Burbridge's Harry. And that was his full name. And it really painted this picture to me of how the animals and the people are being treated kind of the same way.
Yeah. And that's a lot, frankly. It reminds me a lot of how they wrote the Handmaids and the Handmaid's Tale, and how their names are all of, and then the man that they belong to. So, yeah. And it's very, It's funny that that's what it makes me think of, but no, it is.
Yeah. It's this common thread of like when you see people as essentially the belongings of a person. Lexington would continue to race 4 more times, one of these races being a race against time. Rather than competing against other horses, Lexington competed against a stopwatch and managed to break the 4-mile track record, a record that he held for 20 years. In 1855, Lexington defeated his rival, Lecomte, despite being partially blind. By the end of 1855, Lexington was retired due to his blindness. While this blindness was thought to have been inherited from Lexington's sire, Boston, modern evidence points towards a large abscess causing the horse's blindness. For whatever reason, Lexington's blindness did not prevent breeders from utilizing his stud service.
It's a little concerning, to be honest.
Yeah.
But I feel like at the time they didn't really have the ability to investigate it all too much.
Also, another thing is that Lexington had essentially a very good PR team for the time. And since modern evidence is now pointing towards a large abscess, basically they looked at his skeleton and saw all of this deformity that would have been caused by infection. I imagine that is something that his caretakers at the time could have pointed to, that maybe just didn't get, necessarily written down. But definitely something that if someone was like, oh, well, his sire went blind too, and if they were like, well, he had this really bad infection in this abscess, and so we think that's probably why he's gone blind. They probably, again, had a really good team selling him and being like, don't worry.
Yeah, don't worry. There's no way your foal's going to have that. Not for at least 17 years. I promise.
Which, yeah, lucky for them, it wasn't inherited. Because I don't think.
Can you imagine how poorly that would have gone? But then again, I don't think he would have gotten to 575 offspring if that was or did end up being inherited. That would have been a bit of a stuff up.
So Lexington stood for stud for 24 years and was the top stud for 16 of those years. So definitely, maybe around 10 years in to that, they definitely would have noticed if all of his...
Do we know what his stud fee was at the time? I would be interested to see what his stud fee was at the time converted into today's money, because
it was expensive.
Yeah, because in comparison, you've got the top stud standing right now in the US, which is Into Mischief, and his stud fee is $250,000 for live.
Oh my god!
For live standing and nursing, and
is that a thoroughbred?
Yeah, absolutely. No, thoroughbreds hold the absolute cake of ridiculously expensive and mortifyingly costly stud fees. Yes.
He stood for a price of $100 until 1861. Then, when he first led the sire list, he was increased to $200. And then he stood for a limited public fee of $500, and that was the highest in the country and was comparable to English stallions.
Okay, so
at the time,
if he stood stud for 28 years and he was $100 in this 1861, if I do let's do $500 in 1880, give or take 20 years. $500 in that money today is still only just over $15,000. So if you said $15,000 to $20,000, that's don't get me wrong, that is an insane amount of money for a breeding. Not even for a horse itself, but for the breeding. And I can guarantee you that they probably didn't have such a strict rules. I don't doubt that they probably had a same sort of standing in, a live foal standing and nursing, no failure to thrive sort of thing. But it probably wouldn't have been as strict as today's, bazillion page contracts that you have to sign and go through. But yeah, it's a lot. But today's ones are even more insane.
Unfortunately, discord in Lexington's life did not subside with the end of his racing career. During the American Civil War, it was not uncommon for thoroughbreds to be conscripted or outright stolen in order to serve as cavalry mounts. Near the point of the start of the American Civil War, so around 1861, Lexington lived in Kentucky on the farm of Robert Alexander. Despite his ownership of enslaved people, Alexander would not hand over his prized thoroughbreds to the Confederate Army. Later in the war, in 1865, Confederate forces attacked and raided Alexander's stud farm and the neighboring towns. The army stole 15 prized horses during the raid. Lexington was not one of these horses. Lexington was likely moved to Illinois prior to the attack, out of fear that this very thing would occur. Being completely blind at this point, it is unlikely that Lexington would have survived on the battlefield, no matter which side he was conscripted to.
That is crazy that they were like, oh, it's absolutely going to happen to us. And they said, just get him out of here. They took all the really important ones, all the really good ones, the ones that they could still make money off, and shipped them off to Illinois because they were like, at least we'll still have our money machines. It's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also like crazy to me. Like, I grew up in California. California was like kind of involved. They chose a side and everything. But there weren't like a ton of battles going on. So I'm not gonna lie that during like my history classes, I grew up thinking it was very clear cut, North versus South. But then I learned more about the Civil War, and I learned about how like different army forces were like attacking and raiding what was should have been like their own home.
Yeah, I was gonna say they
like,
just didn't care.
town.
They knew that they weren't they weren't contributing to the war effort, and they were like, oh bugger it, we'll come take it ourselves. Like, that's crazy.
Essentially.
Yeah, it's like, these people aren't your friends. I promise you that.
Yeah, like when we say raided that town, like they burnt buildings, they did all sorts of things, like they ransacked it. Which like, damn, they were kind of on your side.
Yeah, it's like, well, I guess you guys will be happy. Just, if you win, you'll just be ruling over the ashes, I guess.
Lexington lived out the remainder of his days rather peacefully and died in 1875. His body was buried in front of the stables. Lexington's body was later exhumed, and his bones were mounted to be displayed at a World's Fair in Philadelphia. His bones were not prepared in time for the event, but the skeleton was then donated to the Smithsonian Institute. Over the years, Lexington's skeleton was shuffled around between various locations and exhibits within the Smithsonian. At some point, his identity was lost, and the skeleton was simply labeled as Horse, which is basically where the 2022 novel Horse gets its name. In 2010, the identity of the skeleton was rediscovered, and Lexington made a homecoming to Kentucky in time for the World Equestrian Games. This is where Lexington remains, on permanent loan to the International Museum of the Horse, in the town where he was born over 170 years ago.
It would have been wild if they had have mounted him back in there and given him the name Darley back. That would have been wild, but I suppose by then most people knew him as Lexington, and that was his name that got him his fame, so how could you call him anything else?
Yeah. Plus, like, now he's like
in his
Lexington.
town. Yeah, it's his. He's like, wow, they named it after me. It's not the other way around, I promise.
This town was named after that horse.
I would tell people that if I lived there, unironically. But that's like Australians telling people that drop bears exist, I do it just to screw with people because it's funny.
Oh my god. The amount of times that my emotions have been played with about drop bears.
Just yes,
because
excellent.
like I've met quite a few people from Australia in high school because we had an exchange program. And they half of them would insist that drop bears were real, and the other half were like, no, I'm just fucking with you.
That's exactly how it should be.
Yeah.
Too confusing to figure it out.
Wait, so I'm pretty sure what I was told was that drop bears were like koalas that have rabies or something and would just drop out of the trees onto people and attack them.
That's close enough. It's usually like whatever people are like, oh, I got told drop bears are this, I'll just agree with them. Because that's what they believe the most at that point, and that's the easiest way to sell it to them.
Like, I've also seen them as, like, depicted as a cryptid.
Yeah, the cryptid is what you usually get.
I love that. That's, like, back when I lived in Humboldt County, I was a tour guide for a
Mm.
while, and I gave a tour to this British couple, and at least for them, they were not familiar with, like, Bigfoot, or at least they were not familiar with how big Bigfoot is in the US, and I was trying to explain the concept of Bigfoot to them, where I'm like, "Well," because 'cause they're like, is it real?" And I'm like, "Well, that's the question, isn't it?" I'm like, "He's like a cryptid," and they, like, kinda looked
Yeah.
confused, and they seemed, like, really like, they were thinking, "Oh, this is like a creature that you just told us about," and I'm like, "No, like, I'm not telling you Bigfoot's real, but I'm not telling
But
you Bigfoot's not
yeah, I'm
real."
not telling you he's not.
I guess Bigfoot's, like, our cryptid, but we have quite a few throughout the
I was gonna say, you guys have a big list.
Yeah, in Texas, the big one is
Yeah,
Chupacabra.
yeah. That's the one I know the most about. Something that I've also noticed while we've gotten through this is a bit of an embarrassing admission for me. When Keegan and I used to play Red Dead Redemption roleplay together, my character bred thoroughbreds because we were really into setting up races for people and having a great time. And because I'm a nerd and because we bred thoroughbreds in game, I went through and I found a list of about 6 or 7 very real stallions that were born between the 1870s and the 90s, just because our server operated within the time of 1896 it was at the time.
Mhm.
And one of the horses on my list that I borrowed to use as my stud in game was Spendthrift, because I couldn't help myself. I was like, I'm just going to say that. And it's funny because Spendthrift was one of Lexington's foals.
Mhm.
Or rather, Lexington was his grandsire on his mother's side. So he came from a stallion named Australian, and his dam was named Aerolite. But Aerolite's sire was Lexington, and her dam was Florine. But I just thought it was very funny. I was like, what are the chances that one of the stallions that I used in game were one of his progeny? And yes, they were.
So even our Red Dead server
Has yeah.
has Lexington
Yeah,
bloodlines in it.
100%. Yeah.
That's
In my head,
that's so funny.
our server lore at some point bought a stud breeding to him.
That's so funny.
But yeah, I thought I'd just self-report on that one. It's very, very funny.
It would be pretty funny if Lovelace was related to Lexington. If my roleplay racing
Oh,
thoroughbred.
hang on. I can probably tell you if it was, because it probably was, because I had the stallions based on the coat colors that they were.
So I had the
If you
brindle.
had the brindle one, let me go check. This will be so funny. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, it was the brindle.
Wait,
Yeah,
really?
it was. Hang on, let me show you.
I had a Lexington foal.
Let's go. Yeah, look at this. Hang on.
That's so funny.
There you go. That's what it is. That's in my spread. That's from my spreadsheet.
Oh my god, I love this. This is so funny. Wow.
What are the chances? Oh my god! Out of the 6 that I used, no wait, how many did I use? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, no, it was 6.
I know. Look at them there. Boston, Alice
Yep,
Carneal,
there they are.
and Lexington.
That's so cool.
That is really funny. Dang, you really put so much effort into those
Oh, way too much.
horses.
Way too much.
Lexington is an important horse within the history of American thoroughbred racing, but he is more than simply a horse who had a lot of babies. Lexington's story gives us a glimpse into the stories of many humans living during the time preceding and during the American Civil War. It is undeniable that the experiences of African American people are intertwined with the development of the American thoroughbred and the sport of horse racing. Seeing that there are still many more stories to tell, The International Museum of the Horse has actually created the Chronicle of African Americans in the Horse Industry. The mission of the Chronicle is to document and archive the history of African Americans in the horse industry, expand knowledge of the people, places, and events, and interpret these experiences as included in the fabric of American history. If you are interested in learning more about this subject, check out the Chronicle of African Americans in the Horse Industry online at africanamericanhorsestories.org. Thank you for listening to History from Horseback. We hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you like what you heard, please consider leaving a rating or review, or consider following us on Facebook and Instagram. As a new upcoming podcast, we rely on your feedback to grow and improve. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you out on the trail.